Hello and welcome to this webinar taking place on Human Rights Day. My name is Nienke Grossman and I'm a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law and co-chair of the Advancing Gender Justice signature topic at the American Society of International Law, along with Christina Bahari of Foley Hoag and Carrie Bettinger Lopez of the University of Miami. The Advancing Gender Justice signature topic aims to explore areas of agreement and divergence in global efforts to achieve gender justice, highlight successes and failures, examine limitations, and assess obstacles and consider strategies for achieving gender justice in international law and institutions. With an emphasis on listening and dialogue, the signature topic is utilizing various modalities, including interviews, panels, expert gatherings, focus groups, and webinars like this one to engage with and collect insights from individuals within and beyond ASIL. Today, we're very happy to be co-hosting with ASIL's new LGBTQIA+ persons interest group, an event on LGBTQ+ rights at a crossroads, legal progress and backlash. This panel will explore where we are now in the global struggle for LGBTQ+ rights, what progress has been made through legal mechanisms, and how that progress is being challenged. We also hope to discuss where the LGBTQ+ movement will go from here and what can be done to prevent further backlash and backsliding and advance the cause of LGBTQ+ rights going forward. We're really looking forward to hearing from our three speakers today, all of whom have been deeply involved in the protection and promotion of the human rights of LGBTQ+ people. I will now turn the microphone over to Professor Carrie Bettinger Lopez for introductions to our speakers. After introductions, we'll have 2 rounds of questions for our speakers and then Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to collect your thoughts and think of what questions you'd like to ask, and feel free to type them in the Q&A button or at the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Thanks so much, and now I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Thanks so much, Nienke. And we are, yes, very thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar on Human Rights Day, and really want to encourage listeners also to go to the signature topic webpage as part of ASIL's webpage, where you can find other webinars and items that are associated with the signature topic on gender justice and international law. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our 3 incredible speakers. And so I will read their biographies. You can look them up online and see how incredible they are. And then we'll get started with the conversation. So first, Jessica Stern served as the U.S. Special Envoy to advance human rights of LGBTQI+ persons, the first human rights expert and the last person to hold that role, where she directed U.S. foreign policy to combat violence and discrimination worldwide. For a decade prior, Jessica led Outright International as the executive director, leading its global advocacy, research, and grant making. In 2025, Jessica co-founded the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice alongside 7 former ambassadors, special representatives, and special envoys to place human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy. She also serves as an inaugural senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights. Next, Victor Madrigal Borlos, a Costa Rican lawyer, is a senior visiting researcher at UCLA's Williams Institute and Harvard Law School. Victor served in senior positions in the Inter-American Human Rights System and at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Among his many other roles from 2018 to 2023, he held a mandate of the UN expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Victor is the recipient of the Kaleidoscope Trust Lifetime Achievement Award and the Human Rights Campaign's Global Equality Award. And in 2025, he was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General as a trustee of the UN Voluntary Fund for Torture Victims. And last, but certainly not least, is Lisa Davis. who is the Senior Associate Dean of Clinical Programs and a professor of law and co-director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY Law School. Lisa is also the special advisor on gender and other discriminatory crimes to the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, having formerly served as the special advisor on gender persecution. They drafted the first ever policy on the crime of gender persecution for the ICC Office of the Prosecutor, in addition to writing and reporting extensively on gender-based crimes and human rights issues in conflict and other settings, crisis settings, including on women's rights and LGBTQI rights. We are so pleased and honored to have the three of you as panelists today. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ninke to kick us off with our first round of questions.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So in this round, we'll ask our speakers to comment on spaces of progress and backlash involving LGBTQ plus rights, drawn from their experience and expertise for about 5 minutes each. So we'll start with Jessica. And Jessica, we'd love to hear from you about what you're seeing with respect to progress and backsliding on LGBTQI plus rights in US foreign policy and its consequences for the global movement. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dinke. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you to ASIL for this amazing opportunity. I never want a Human Rights Day to pass without doing something in dialogue with people who care about human rights. So it feels really good to be here with all of you today. Where to start? I want to start by just reviewing the basic facts. When we talk about LGBTQI rights around the world and why the US government should integrate LGBTQI issues into its foreign policy, it's not because it's a nice to do. It's not because it should be seen as a luxury item or a charming consideration in June for Pride. We should work on LGBTQI issues because it's the moral thing to do, and because it's in Americans' best interests. So why is that? On the moral side, there are more than 60 countries around the world that criminalize homosexuality. There are countless countries around the world that have direct forms of laws that criminalize so-called cross-dressing or deny trans and non-binary and intersex people legal recognition before the law because of strict or impossible legal requirements for gender recognition. And there are roughly 10 countries around the world that punish homosexuality with death. So clearly in 2025, this form of targeting of LGBTQI people is unconscionable. But we should also care about these issues because it's in our collective best interest to ensure that the rule of law applies equally to everybody. The test of the rule of law is not how it protects the most privileged, but the most vulnerable among us. So I'll start with progress and then go to backlash, which is not the sequence I prefer to go in, but I know that we have a second round of questions. When I served as the US Special Envoy for LGBTQI rights, it was transformative. I was the first ever human rights expert in our country's history to serve in that capacity. And at our peak, I was one of just 5 special envoys for LGBTQI plus rights around the world. And as will come as little surprise to most of our audience, there currently is no special envoy for LGBTQI rights. So I was the first human rights expert in that role, but unfortunately right now I'm also the last. But when I was in that role, I saw what it looks like to institutionalize LGBTQI issues in US foreign policy, and it's transformative. It looks like a diplomatic infrastructure that can respond when LGBTQI people are arrested arbitrarily for walking down the street. It looks like the State Department's annual human rights reports, which are resources that function as quasi-evidentiary records for courts and asylum adjudicators and advocates, actually document human rights abuses against LGBTQI people. And it looks like multilateral coalitions that recognize that isolated violations of LGBTQI people's rights amount to patterns of state responsibility. And I think it's really important to say, it also looks like sustained funding from the US and other bilateral donors that enables LGBTQI civil society movements and their allies to vindicate rights through the law. Um, Unfortunately, we all know that progress was not uniform and it was not guaranteed. But what we're seeing today is not just simple neglect, it's really an active reversal of those incremental steps forward. So I'll just give three examples. The first is the abrupt termination of US foreign assistance and humanitarian programs that produce protections and resources for LGBTQI people. The second is the dismantling of the human rights infrastructure inside US foreign policy. And the third is the reframing of the Trump administration from human rights to so-called natural rights. And with the time that we have, I'll just speak very briefly about these. But your listeners may know that on the first day of the Trump administration, he issued three executive orders that had immediate and devastating consequences for LGBTQI people around the world. One was the executive order allegedly pausing foreign assistance, but as we know, that became a termination that resulted in more than $68 billion being frozen towards life-saving programs worldwide. The second was an executive order falsely claiming that recognition of the rights of transgender people undermine the rights of women and girls and amounts to so-called gender ideology. And the third was a termination of all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which were designed to ensure equal access for those who'd been historically marginalized. And taken together, this was like the trifecta of doom, because what it really meant was that any targeted programs for LGBTQI people in US foreign policy would have to be stopped immediately. And I'll just draw to an end by saying I just came back from a meeting in South Africa, and I met with a group of Tanzanian LGBTQI activists who were talking about how the withdrawal of US political and financial support has impacted them. And they said that overnight, their medical clinics closed, their doctors and nurses were fired, and they lost access to life-saving medication, including HIV medication. And when I asked them how are they coping and what were they trying to do to survive, they said when they could access HIV meds, they were rationing them or sharing them with each other or turning to home remedies. So Carrie, I'm sorry I couldn't start with a more optimistic note, but I think this Human Rights Day, what we have to start by saying is that the situation is quite dire and it's going to take tenacious commitment to turn the situation around.
Thank you, Jessica, for getting us started with what is clearly not good news overall. So thank you. I think, we need to understand what's actually happening, and so your thoughts and comments are really helpful, um, although difficult to hear. All right, so now we're going to turn to Lisa, and we're going to ask Lisa if you could share with us some background and thoughts about progress and backlash that you've seen involving LGBTQI plus rights and the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak about this issue. We don't really have a lot of wins or moments to have wins for LGBT rights, or even more broadly, women's rights or gender justice generally under international criminal law, because tribunals like the ICC, they just move so slow. So change is very, very slow compared to the fast pace of rights that we can win under human rights law. And of course, as Jessica was just speaking about, those rights are now under threat, especially the progress we've made in terms of um, being able to support movements and communities worldwide. So in conflict, we we see that LGBTQI plus persons are, of course, vulnerable and victims in conflict. I would say they're most likely victims in almost every conflict, because when a perpetrator rolls into town, one of the first things they try to do is exert their authority by picking on those who are the most vulnerable. And that's almost always going to include LGBTQI plus people. So in terms of progress that we've seen, this kind of really is a story that goes back to 2018, 2019, when the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty was starting to become more visible to civil society, and it's been making its way through the UN system. And when we looked at that treaty, we saw that the treaty had cut and pasted the same definition of gender from the Rome Statute. And that's an outdated, opaque definition of gender that says like the two sexes, male and female, in the context of society. And because that definition is so opaque and outdated, that's probably part of the reason why we never saw gender persecution charges come to fruition at the International Criminal Court, or more largely under international criminal law and other tribunals. And that's really important because gender persecution is one of our explicit charges. It's our holistic charge that we have to recognize discrimination committed against LGBTQI plus persons in conflict, to recognize those hate crimes, you might say, that are committed against LGBT people. So we need that charge, and it's had never been charged, and that's a tragedy. And part of it's this outdated definition. So when they cut and pasted it into the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, there became this real question of why. And the answer was they really just never looked at gender issues when they were developing the treaty. In fact, gender had never come up once in any of the conversations about that treaty. So as a law professor, this was something I was interested in and concerned about. And I was talking to different experts and talking to the International Law Commission, which was developing the treaty. But as a law professor, as an academic, there's only so far I can go in terms of the work that I can do. I can find it and talk about it. But then if you really want to carry this work into advocacy, you have to work with LGBT rights movement, and you have to work with those organizations. So I was very lucky to be able to work with Jessica Stern on this panel, who was the executive director at that point of Outright International. And when I brought this to Jessica, Jessica and I worked to alert states, civil society actors, organize convenings on 4 different continents. And through that work and that power of the LGBT rights community and the women's rights community, who also was coming to this forefront and affected by this issue, we were actually able to get a critical mass of special rapporteurs, dozens of them, and almost 24 states to speak out about this issue. And the result was they removed the definition from the treaty. Now, fast forward to today. After that happened, I became the special advisor on gender persecution for the court, and I was asked to write a policy paper on gender persecution. And I clarified in that policy paper that this definition of gender does include the targeting of LGBTQI plus victims. And we have a really great tool under the Rome Statute, which governs the ICC, and that's Article 21. And what Article 21 says is you can look at international human rights law when you're interpreting the treaty. So that and the way that the elements around persecution are written made it very, very clear that, of course, LGBTQI plus persons are included. But we needed to be able to explain that and show that and teach prosecutors how to charge that. And that's what that policy paper did. And it came out in 2022. And then, or 2023. And then what do we see just this year? We finally saw recognition for the first time in any international tribunal, the recognition of LGBTQI plus victims. And that was in Afghanistan. And that was through the arrest warrants that were just confirmed in July by the International Criminal Court for gender persecution. And that the systematic persecution of Afghans, which included women, girls, and LGBTQI plus person, was based on gender, and also the persecution of allies, of those who spoke out, spoke up for them. And this is a critical moment because we've never had that recognition. So as a member of the court, I also worked with the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, in Colombia, and they also brought charges. They actually beat us to it. And they even looked at an intersectional approach. They looked at LGBTQI plus victims and women, but also at the intersection of race and ethnicity. So looking at Afro-Colombian and indigenous LGBTQI plus persons and women. And that's important because we want to get racism and misogyny and homophobia. We want to be able to capture all of those reasons that fuel conflict. Because if we don't recognize them during conflict, when they're happening, if we only get the rape or murder, but we don't get that discrimination that drives it, how are we going to root out misogyny and racism after conflict? How are we going to do that? It's not going to even be on the agenda. So it's really, really important work. And this was a great win at the ICC. And it was won, during, a crescendo moment during the Trump administration. Because those warrants were fired in January, and those incredibly brave judges at the court confirmed them just this past July. So change is possible, and it happens when you marry your movement building around your litigation or advocacy. Now, with the minute I have left, well, I'll just say where we're going next. So my mandate has changed at the court. I became the special advisor on gender and other discriminatory crimes. And that was really a recognition that we have to look at gender crimes from an intersectional point of view, like the HEP does, right? Looking at why your race and your gender informs how you're discriminated against, why you're targeted by perpetrators. And that's so important to do that intersectional work, and also in our movement building, but also in our litigation and strategy. So what are we looking at now? Well, on the horizon, we have a new charge that's being proposed to be codified in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, and that's gender apartheid. And the example that's used is the Afghanistan example. When you look at the elements of apartheid and you apply it from a gender lens, you can see how it really applies to women, girls, and LGBTQI plus persons. But it always comes back to that same idea of how do we understand gender, and how do we understand race, and how do we understand these terms in terms of the crime of apartheid. So we've done that work for the crime of persecution. That's everything I just talked about. But we have to do that work for the crime of apartheid as well, so that we're making sure that we're taking an intersectional approach, that we're including women, we're including LGBT people, and not leaving them out. We're including groups like Palestinians or Rohingya that are in situations that may amount to apartheid, and making sure that they're not excluded either. And that's what that intersectional approach really means, because the anti-gender rights movement is very alive and well, and it's thriving stronger now than it ever has before. And we see this in terms of even the debates around the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. There are some states who keep bringing up the fact that the gender definition that was outdated and taken from the Rome Statute was removed. They keep bringing this up. Those states are being prompted by anti-gender rights activists who define gender as a biology. That would degrade rights for women and totally erase them for LGBT people. So this is still alive and well, and this is work we still have to do, because we have to make sure that that definition doesn't come back into the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, because they don't have an Article 21 like the Rome Statute. They'll just be stuck with outdated understandings. And we also have to do this in terms of how we codify apartheid, so that we can capture what happens to women, girls, and LGBTQI plus persons in terms of an institutionalized oppression, but that we're also including other groups that are persecuted based on, that amounts to racial apartheid. And this we do through movement building, right? Building women's groups, LGBT groups, racial justice groups, working together to make sure that we're codifying the right crimes in that treaty, and that we're pushing back against all of that anti-gender rights, all of that anti-DEI, all of that anti-racial justice propaganda that's coming out of the current administration and other authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll have more time in the second round to discuss sort of where we go from here as well. And let me turn now to Victor. And so, Victor, it'd be great to hear from you about what you're seeing in terms of progress and backlash for LGBTQI plus movements globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ninke, and thank you to the colleagues in the panel. It's a great honor to be in this conversation with you. I would like to kind of take up where Lisa ended her presentation, which is the centrality of this concept of gender and the way that it's understood as being exclusionary or inclusive, and the consequences that that has in the very specific protections that are afforded to these communities. I think that one of the fundamental risks that I see manifesting themselves in many corners of the world, it's actually an argument that attempts to separate that inclusive understanding of gender with the issue of gender identity. And this argument pretty much goes to the effect of saying that only trans persons have gender identity, and that because only trans persons have gender identity, then their plight and their struggles are different from lesbian, gay, bisexual persons whose point of departure is sexual orientation. And I think this understanding fundamentally negates the reality that we are all living in gendered societies, that we are all affected and impacted by these systems, preconceptions, and understanding of power that lies very much at the source of all systems of discrimination and privilege. And it's one of the strategies that is being waged in very many, I think, latitudes in the world. And as Lisa was mentioning, I think it's fundamental that we continue with these inclusive readings, which are the ones that lead to communities working together, and to see gender justice essentially not only as an exercise relating to sex, of course, but also very much to the asymmetries of power, and then connecting with anti-racist struggles, with other struggles for social justice. When it comes to the way that all of this percolates and actually creates impact at local level, I think it's important that we bear in mind two things. This is something that Jessica alluded to, and I'm also taking point of departure there. The reception of all of these concepts in international law is relatively recent in terms of development. And of course, it feels extremely urgent and extremely dire today because we are in the middle of it. But I think that we must remember that the case of Tunen, the first case that actually acknowledged non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, was only issued in 1994. And even that case had as at point of departure of the analysis, basically the idea of privacy, that is the underlying message that as long as gay persons and lesbian persons kept their sexual intimacy in the bedroom, it was illegitimate to interfere with it. But it never dealt with the idea of LGBT identities as exercises of occupation of public space. And it has been throughout the last 30 years that the work of human rights defenders and activists and scholars has taken this idea of occupying public space, publicly manifesting as LGBT, and actually leading to such progress as decriminalization in 29 countries over the last 2 decades, and over 50 countries actually issuing comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation in the last 2 decades. So I think that for a relatively recent exercise of codification in international law, this movement has been extremely successful at achieving some definite gains and a profound transformation in international human rights law. Now, local contexts. It's very important to look at recent research that is actually linking the way in which same-sex intimacy is 3 times more likely to be criminalized in autocracies than in democracies. So recent research coming from Pauselli and Urso in the Journal of Democracy shows that it is likely to have criminalization in 47% of autocracies, whereas only 16% of democracies criminalize same-sex intimacy. 88% of autocracies have absolute criminalization or non-recognition of gender marker change, whereas it is more likely in democracies to have recognition of gender identity. And this is important because I think that it shows that there is a connection between the recognition of the human rights of LGBT persons and concepts that Jessica was alluding to, such as rule of law and separation of powers and the protection of minorities. Now, the theory that scholars of democracy are drawing these days is that the repression of the human rights of LGBT persons becomes essential to autocracy models because not only they are seen as a manifestation of liberal exercises, but LGBT movements are also seen as at the forefront of liberal exercises. And the way in which this is manifesting in backsliding, and I will be very succinct when it comes to this, is that there is a well-concerted, well-financed exercise in different countries. Already Tanzania was mentioned. The Horn of Africa is clearly an example, but so is the Russian Federation and the COI communities of influence, where law is being used to make illegitimate the associations promoting the human rights of LGBT persons, or further criminalizing same-sex intimacy, or exercises such as those existing in the Islamic cooperation, where there is a strategy that has been issued aiming at delegitimizing the use of gender identity and sexual orientation at the United Nations and other regional fora. All of this leads to polarized landscapes within countries where it is more likely to see the plight of LGBT persons as patrimony of one political party and one political agenda, leading to seismic shifts of the protection depending on what the result of one election is, and great political vicissitude. That is the context where we are, but and as Jessica was mentioning, great impact has been felt by LGBT organizations and communities worldwide. But it's also important to bear in mind that the LGBT movement is robust and resilient, and it's capable of producing, for example, highly sophisticated data where states are not collecting it, and it's capable of great innovation in community resilience in topics of such urgency as climate change and armed conflict, as the gender movements showed in Colombia. So I think that we have movements of that represent great assets for the fight for social justice. And now, of course, our agenda is to devise ways in which we can ensure that they continue to be supported throughout this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor, Lisa, and Jessica, for those amazing responses to our initial round of questions. We're going to jump into round 2 now and really further develop on several of the issues that you flagged and raised, the ideas that you set forth. And we'll go in reverse order this time, if that's okay. Victor, if we could kind of call on you to further expand. I want to invite our panelists to share thoughts about kind of the path forward, where we go from here. And several of you have already touched on this, but a few questions that we've asked you to think about: what we can learn about the struggle for LGBTQI plus rights from what we're seeing, what we can do to prevent further backsliding and to advance the cause of LGBTQI plus rights going forward, And a few other thoughts that emerged for me while listening to all of you speak. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about any counter arguments, right, that are that you're grappling with, either ones that are evergreen and have always been there, or new counter arguments or new contexts in which those counter arguments are being presented or dealt with. Another kind of set of questions as we think about the path forward that I'd be curious for you all to talk about is a little bit more of a drill down in the domestic context. Jessica kind of started us there thinking about the U.S. context and the transformation that we've seen in terms of U.S. foreign policy, foreign assistance, and kind of the politicization of so many aspects of LGBTQI plus rights, and want to invite any of you to further talk about the national context, whether it's kind of domestic facing or foreign policy facing. I'm also interested to further drilling down on that, like Lisa, for you to maybe help us understand a little bit more, in particular in Afghanistan context, to think more about how Afghan women and other kind of grassroots organizations or local or national groups there have responded to the gender apartheid charges. Yes, and finally, just Victor, as you kind of formulate all of this, wanted to just mention, picking up on your note about LGBTQI identity as an exercise of public space. So important, and a shout out to one of my students who recently wrote an intervention to the Inter-American Court on this very subject. The Inter-American Court is considering an advisory opinion right now submitted by Guatemala in late 2024, asking if states must promote democracy as an autonomous human right, and so as a means to achieve other rights. And so this very question that you're talking about kind of identity as an exercise of public space, I think very much ties into the question of how we define democracy in international human rights spaces. So anyway, with that kind of set of ingredients, I invite each of you to expand on your thoughts.
Thank you, Carrie. That was a very broad agenda that you just laid out. So I'm not sure that I can do it justice, but I will begin, and I'm going to trust that my admired colleagues and friends, Lisa and Jessica, are going to pick up on the many things that I'm going to leave out, I'm sure. But just let me begin by saying that I think that it's important to take these moments to reflect on different aspects that will make the plight for social justice, and within that plight, our movements stronger and more able to respond to some of these issues. And I think lessons are usually best expressed when they are simple. The first one is some of these discussions are complex, and they are complex because some of the issues that this movement is trying to deconstruct relate to the very principles or ways in which societies have been structured for, in some cases, millennia. So what we're going against is fundamental ways to organize society. In front of that claim, I believe that even the best intentioned of stakeholders sometimes may feel some vertigo as to understanding, well, how are you going to express rights of women and girls if you completely eliminate the binary? I think that is an important question to address and to answer, because I am aware that the instruments that protect the rights of women and girls are written in the binary. In the very binary that oppresses women and girls, they're written in that binary. And so how deconstructing it is something that is not going to leave a vacuum, is something that needs to be addressed both by scholars and by political thinkers. That concern, as expressed very clearly by Jessica, has been a very effective political tool against the rights of trans persons. And so I think that we need to acknowledge that these discussions are difficult, that they demand good answers from our movements and others as well, and that they are possible, of course, to take. The second one, very quickly, is I think that we need to resist the notion that the movement was going too fast. Nobody goes too fast in defending their rights. I have been many times asked by persons who I admire, who I know are human rights workers, saying, well, don't you think that you should have actually brought society with you in relation to trans issues? And my answer is always the same. I am not going to ask from anybody in this planet that they wait to exercise the human rights that are inherent to their existence as human beings. The reality is, I don't think that there was a mistake by the movements. I think that there was an incredibly well-financed and resourced campaign that continues to use their existences for political profit. Let me just compare the most that the LGBT movement has ever been financed, according to the Global Philanthropy Project, is $905 million in the 22-23 period. In the same period, only 3 of the organizations that are acting to counter gender inclusive movements were financed at the tune of $1.8 billion. So that is double the whole LGBT movement and 3 organizations on the other side. So, of course, what we're looking at is an asymmetry of power and resources in the way that these instruments are driven, and an irresponsible and very reckless use of trans existences for political power. And the third one, I think it's the acknowledgement that the movement cannot be looking inwards only. To me, there is an essential trait in all of these movements, and that is that we are procuring to dismantle systems of domination, discrimination, and privilege, and therefore we're all connected. And I don't think I can conceive an LGBT movement, a feminist movement, an anti-racist movement that do not conceive their causes as inextricably linked to one another. And so I think that the job right now is to take those lessons and others that undoubtedly will be articulated by my colleagues and take forward the resilience, the ingenuity, and the strength of this movement. And of course, amongst the audience, there will be many students. I hope that this is part of what we take as a resolve in our endeavors going forward for generations. Because I think that only connected we will be able to make that progress.
Thank you so much. Very wise words. Excellent. Lisa, I'd love to turn to you now to further expand upon some of these questions about directions forward.
Sure. I mean, just to go back to your question about what the response was from Afghan women and girls around the announcement of the arrest warrants for gender persecution, it was actually phenomenal. I mean, there was just an outpouring of joy and relief and recognition that women and girls are victims, that LGBTQ plus people are victims of these crimes, and that when you torture someone, when you beat someone because of the way they dress, because they're expressing their right to protest, their right to freedom of assembly, their right to education, that these are discriminatory crimes and that they should be held accountable. And I think it goes so far and does so much for victims to be able to have that kind of recognition and to feel like someone is listening, someone sees them, and somebody recognizes what happened to them is wrong. Now, with that being said, the court has recently taken a decision to seal all arrest warrants moving forward so that they won't be open in terms of telling the public that they've been filed. And this was a decision that the court really took to apply to all cases around the world that it investigates, to really protect victims and to protect investigations and to ensure that they're able to operate in a safe manner and provide safety to witnesses and victims and, be able to catch perpetrators when they're on the run without giving them too much notice about, what's happening, so they're not as preemptive in their strategizing to evade accountability. So that was a decision that the court has recently made for very strategic reasons. And of course, it has its ups and downs. The downside is victims do like to hear when arrest warrants come out, but the upside is that it offers a greater layer of protection to everyone involved in a case. But with that being said, sometimes something like trials are not on the table. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that trials for perpetrators in Afghanistan are in the foreseeable future. Maybe someday. But sometimes when you can't get that level of accountability, just having the recognition that the wrong has happened is an excellent starting place and sends a chilling effect to the world to say, these are perpetrators of crimes against humanity. This is not the legal authority of the country. These were not people elected by the people under them, and that there are real crimes happening. And that is an important message to maintain with states in the international community, so that that is at the forefront of their minds, much like Australia just recently did. They just recently sanctioned Taliban leaders, I think in part of this larger recognition of the situation there. And that helps us also retain dignity and respect for survivors of gender persecution crimes.
Thank you very much. Jessica.
Well, Carrie, you gave us a dissertation worth to think about, but I wasn't expecting any easy questions from you. Um, I think I'll just emphasize, I agree with the incredibly persuasive comments by Victor and Lisa. I think I'm going to focus on the question of where do we go from here and how do we prevent backsliding? And I'm going to say, remember our history. Today, we're celebrating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948. And it was the embodiment of the difference between theory and practice. Homosexuality was criminalized in the United States in 1948. In fact, it was criminalized all the way until 2003. Um, the Stonewall riots happened in 1969, 21 years after the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And why did the Stonewall riots happen? The Stonewall riots happened for many reasons, including that LGBT people were sick and tired of having to pay bribes to just be safe when they went and hung out with their friends. Um, Bribes to the police, who, if they didn't receive those bribes, would respond with arrests and violence and outings that could get you fired from your job on Monday morning and maybe even evicted from your housing. So when we talk about LGBTQI rights, we know it has never been easy. We have never had enough political or financial resources or allies. But what we have done is we've been able to dream of a better future and be strong and confident that our vision of justice is right, even if it's not the status quo. And I think that's our superpower, whether we're on the front lines of the struggle for gender rights for women and girls or for LGBTQI people. It is that ability to withstand hardship, to diagnose it as unfair, and to fight tenaciously for a different world. And I think that in this moment, that means three things concretely. One, that those of us that fight for gender justice in all of its forms don't throw in the towel, don't give up hope, that we derive inspiration from places like this and community with each other, and we hold the line even when it's hard, and the victories become more incremental and less transformative. But we don't give up. The second thing is we let our allies know how much we appreciate them and how much they matter. And I think that that's absolutely essential because, as Lisa and Victor have been saying, we sink or swim together. And so we really need to be standing side by side with all those that are fighting for justice and welcoming them into our struggle, even if they get pronouns wrong, even if they get the terminology wrong, because we're too small statistically uh, to go at it and win alone. And then the third thing I really want to say is we need to defend the structures of the rule of law and human rights writ large. So this is the time to defend multilateralism um, because we're in an era where states are really undermining any systems of global accountability. We need to defend freedom of thought in academia, the ability of journalism to operate successfully, and even fundamentals like the ability of civil society to operate. And you asked a little bit about the domestic context. This is the first time in my career where I've seen US-based NGOs removing their addresses from their websites and their staff names and bios from their about us pages because they're afraid of retaliation. And so, if we want to succeed in fighting for LGBTQI rights and gender justice, we also have to defend and strengthen the core institutions of democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, Jessica, and Victor, for these very important remarks. I'm thinking through all the points that you've made, sort of in relation to allies, to challenges among movements seeking gender justice, to the areas of tension, divergence, convergence, and sort of the context in which we find ourselves more broadly. You know, should people be people don't have unlimited time and resources, right? So is this the moment where we should all be focusing on democracy, rule of law, and institutions? Maybe, you know, maybe thinking backwards and reflecting. I mean, this is the advancing gender justice signature topic, right? So on the one hand, that makes us think we should focus on gender. We should focus, you know, but it sounds like we need to maybe think a lot more broadly than that when we're talking about human rights. So I don't have a specific question to ask. I'm reacting a little bit just to the wide range of comments and issues that have been raised. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and I think that's because everyone is processing all the comments that have been made and thinking about sort of where to go with all of this. Given the limited time, I want to give the speakers the opportunity to comment very briefly, like 1 minute, to each other's thoughts or to any of the issues that have come up in our discussion so far. And I guess I do have one question, which is, should we be focusing on gender rights? Should we be focusing on advancing gender justice right now? Or should we all be focusing on democracy? So which of you would like to take that easy question first?
I can kick it off because that's not
Sure.
as much pressure as having to build off of the easy stuff that's already been said.
Thank you.
Uh, um, it's not either or. It can't be either or. I mean, we've seen the weaponization of the term gender over the past year, but it started long ago. I mean, we've been fighting. First, we were fighting to ensure that people understood that there was such a thing as gender. And going back to Victor's point, that everybody has a gender. It's not just women who have a gender, and it's not just trans people who have a gender identity. We all have a gender. But today the concept of gender is being deliberately erased from the US government by the US government from its own policies, and it's being contested by the US government in every multilateral space where it appears. So it's a tough climate for advancing work for gender equality. But the US is not the epicenter of the universe. And there are many other countries and communities around the world that are actually holding the line on gender equality. In fact, we've seen quite a number of governments adopt so-called feminist foreign policy in recent years. And, it's not every member of the United Nations, it's not 200 governments around the world, but the fact that that's been a trend in recent years, happening almost at the exact same time that there's been a backlash against gender, means something. It means that this fight is not over. It's active and being contested. But to the point about how these things come together, I would just say there is no democracy without gender justice. And gender justice is much harder to achieve without strong democratic institutions. I think the argument I'm trying to make, Nike, is that that we who have occupied the spaces of gender, need to also spend more time in the spaces of democracy and the rule of law. And that I think if we want to succeed in our work for gender justice, we have to make sure the bigger structures are there to defend us.
Thank you very much, Jessica. We're turning now to Victor, and then we just have a couple of minutes left before the end of the webinar. Thank you, Victor. And then Lisa will give you a chance, obviously, to respond as well if you have any closing comments. Go ahead, Victor.
I'm
Thank
very
you.
upset with Jessica because she stole my soundbite, which was there's no democracy without gender justice. So we'll settle accounts later, Jessica.
I was just going to say, you owe me a lot of money because I've trademarked it already.
That's very good. I will certainly be happy to pay that. Just to say, I think that there is such an intimate connection with the idea of participation and empowerment in gender justice, right? To me, this whole construction is conducive to understanding how you should understand democracy. And Yenke, I think that what all of these different areas of concern present to all of us is different point of entries into the exercise. So of course one can organize one's work as pro-democracy work or gender justice work or LGBT rights, but very quickly it gets to the idea of equal participation and non-discrimination. And I think that centrality actually, to me, makes us lead pretty much to the same point. And so I think that what we should be focusing is trying to defend these principles, that a human rights-based approach is about non-discrimination, participation, empowerment, and accountability. And as long as those principles are there, they're going to lead us to work on democracy pretty much immediately.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor. Lisa, do you have some concluding remarks before we end?
Yeah, I mean, I think Victor and Jessica really said it all. I mean, just to, piggyback off of what they said and to say that, in times where we are fighting the hardest to not lose ground and to respond to the conveyor belt of crises that are coming at us, we have to remember how important movement building is, and we have to remember to stop and just take a moment to appreciate wins that we get, whether those wins are just sustaining grounds or advancing it or just helping save a life. That's the way that we can help re-energize and recharge our own battery. And to remember that, this is just a moment in time, that that these moments change, but how we respond now will set the stage for the future. And it's important that we unite and fight.
Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Lisa Davis, Victor Madrigal-Borlos, and Jessica Stern. Those were such insightful and dare I say, inspiring, or at the very least reassuring comments for us to hear on Human Rights Day today, December 10th. And I want to just thank all of you, thank my co-moderator, Ninke Grossman, and as well as Christina Bahari and our entire signature topic steering committee, of which Lisa Davis is also a part, for the Advancing Gender Justice signature topic. We look forward to continuing the conversation at upcoming events, and there's one in just 2 days, this Friday, December 12th, on innovations in international law in countering gender discrimination. That is co-sponsored with WILIG, which is the Women in International Law Interest Group. And there you'll have an opportunity to engage with several world-renowned experts and leaders on this very important topic. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and we look forward to seeing many of the participants here on Friday, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you very much. Happy Human Rights Day, everyone.